And I've always believed that how you deal with the downside of life really defines how you lead the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Well, the clip is very interesting because it starts out with the admission that life is brutally difficult and sometimes unbearably brutally difficult. And you can see the progressives playing with that notion. It's warped into this sense of victimization, but it does reflect some understanding of the underlying tragic reality of life. And so it's good to get that right out on the table to begin with. Say, well, you're miserable, you have your reasons, and they might be deep reasons. But if you let the misery demoralize you and make you bitter and cynical and cowardly and make you withdraw, then first of all, that's a failure in the highest sense on your part, and all it's going to do is make everything worse. And then you might think, well, what do you have to respond to that? How do you respond to that catastrophe and challenge? And the answer is, and this is what Rocky is telling his son in no uncertain terms, is like, terrible as things are, there's a lot more to you than you can possibly imagine. And that if you face those things forthrightly and with some faith and courage, then you can have the adventure of your life and prevail even over catastrophe. And that's true. Well, I think it's a corollary of an information overload theory, right? I mean, one of the advantages to having the computational power we have is that everything is at your fingertips. And the disadvantage is that everything's in your face. And by everything, it might be 40 million pornographic images. Like, that's a lot. Or an endless array of tragic scenarios. And really endless. And so that's a problem. And the fundamental problem is, how do you handle the fire hose of information? And no one really knows the answer to that. But we should also point out that it's no wonder that young people are demoralized and anxious, because we're doing everything we can to demoralize them and make them anxious. So on the masculine front, we tell young boys that, well, the world's a terrible patriarchal tyranny, and all of that patriarchal tyranny, which is the whole explanation for history, has done nothing but oppress and exploit people and destroy the planet. And so that any manifestation of that masculine impulse on your part is equivalent to the world-destroying force.
Why is it that you've been so vilified for suggesting something which is so palpably true?
Well, I think, first of all, that annoys narcissistic women no end. And it annoys people who think that there are no biological or cultural limits on how we manifest our behaviors. And also it frightens a large number of women, because many women have never had a good relationship with anyone masculine in their life. And so the notion that they would need to establish a trusting relationship with a man, especially if he's also in something approximating a superordinate position, which is what they might like to find him maximally attractive, also implies that they're in some sense going to be under his sway. And if there's no trust there, well, that's absolutely terrifying. And I have some sympathy for that, because there are no shortage of women out there who've never had a positive relationship with anyone masculine. And so they're completely unable to discriminate between narcissistic power and compulsion and confident competence. And so because they can't distinguish that and they're afraid, they put all of that in the same category, which is something like the predator category. And that's not good for them, because, well, as you said, all men aren't predators all the time. And they need to establish a relationship with a man. Well, we've accepted this preposterous hypothesis that your identity is only subjectively defined. And as I've tried to point out on in some of my lectures, the only people who think their identity is subjectively defined are 2-year-olds. And I mean that technically, because 2-year-olds are egocentric, which means they can't bring their identity in alignment with a social norm, which also means that 2-year-olds can't play with other children. They can play beside them, but they can't play with them. That doesn't happen until you're 3. And what happens when you're 3, if you're reasonably well socialized or start to move towards that, is that you learn how to negotiate a social identity. And then identity becomes, obviously it has some roots in your subjectivity and in your biology for that matter, but a sophisticated identity is not only socially negotiated, as the constructivists know perfectly well, but it's got a dynamism about it, because it has to be constantly renegotiated. Like, as we're having a conversation here, to some degree, we're renegotiating our mutual identities because we learn something from each other,
Right.
so we transform.
Right.
We're also trying to figure out to some degree who each of us is in this situation. And then we're also trying to learn, can we play together towards some productive end? And you might ask, well, what do you mean play? And say, well, we're trying to have an interesting conversation.